Close your eyes. Let the modern world fall away into quiet. Imagine going back 6,000 years, like brushing dust off an old book. Then 7,000 years. Then 8,000. You are standing now in the broken ruins of Eridu, the oldest city the Sumerians knew about. But even they could not remember who built it first. In your hands is a clay tablet. It's not a creation story, not about a beginning. It's about something that came after. The Sumerian king list starts with 5 words that should not be possible, after kingship descended from heaven. Not created, not invented, descended. As if power itself fell from somewhere else into a world that was already waiting. This is not the story of how the Anunnaki created civilization. This is the story of what existed before the Anunnaki were ever named, before gods ruled cities, before temples had special meanings, before family trees of gods explained where authority came from. The oldest written words in human history do not describe a beginning. They describe something passed down. Tonight, we will follow that inheritance backward into flood layers, into unnamed forces, into a world the Sumerians themselves remembered as already ancient when writing began. Before we go further into these ancient mysteries, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you're interested in the kind of history that sleeps between flood layers and forgotten foundations. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. The pictures are here to add context, though the story works just as well in darkness. Your support means everything. Let's begin. The story begins not with creation, but with after. After cities already stand. After farming already feeds thousands. After floodwaters have already erased something no one can name. The Anunnaki appear in Sumerian records not as the builders of the world, but as the managers of what remains. And that is the first crack in everything we assume about ancient myth. The earliest Sumerian texts preserved on tablets dug up from Nippur, Uruk, and Eridu do not open with the gods speaking the universe into existence. They open with things already there: water, earth, separation, the boundary between sky and ground. But no voice commands them. No hand shapes them. They simply are. This is the great mystery embedded in the world's oldest written cosmology. The Sumerians did not believe the gods created the world. They believed the gods organized it. And organizing requires something to organize. The oldest creation hymns describe not a moment when gods made everything, but a cosmic condition. Namu, sometimes translated as the primordial waters, sometimes as the first mother, is not a goddess who acts. She is a state of existence. The texts give her no temple, no prayers, no myths of her speaking, ruling, or commanding. She exists in the record as pure potential, undifferentiated, unnamed, and completely impersonal. Compare this with what comes later. By the time the great myths of Enki and Enlil emerge, the gods have personalities. They argue. They work. They assign domains and responsibilities. They govern. But Namu does none of this. She simply is the condition from which differentiation occurs. Scholars examining these early hymns note that Sumerian cosmology does not describe creation from nothing. It describes emergence from something already present. The world is not spoken into being. It is separated, divided, organized like water channeled into irrigation canals, like mud shaped into bricks. This is not the language of magic. This is the language of work. And work requires workers. So the question emerges, quiet and undeniable. If the gods did not create the world, but only organized it, who built what they inherited? The answer lies not in the myths themselves, but in what the myths avoid saying. They avoid describing a beginning. They avoid naming a first cause. They avoid explaining where the systems they describe actually came from. Instead, they begin with a single haunting statement: after kingship descended from heaven, kingship was in Eridu. Not created, not established, descended. As if authority itself, the entire system of rule, hierarchy, and governance, arrived fully formed into a world that was already prepared to receive it. And this is where the silence in the record becomes loudest. Because if kingship descended, that means it existed somewhere else first. Somewhere before Eridu. Somewhere before writing. Somewhere the Sumerians themselves could no longer name. The archaeological evidence supports this unsettling idea. Eridu's layers of occupation stretch back into the 6th millennium BC, long before the Sumerian king list claims kingship arrived. The city was already functioning. Shrines were already being rebuilt generation after generation in exactly the same location. Irrigation canals were already being dug. The gods did not found Eridu. They inherited it. And this pattern repeats at Uruk. The great temple complexes rise from earlier structures, layer upon layer of human labor, extending thousands of years before the myths describe divine intervention. The White Temple sits atop older platforms. The inner precinct grows from simpler shrines. Continuity, not rupture. Evolution, not divine command. The cities were already there. The gods arrived later to explain them. But why? Why would a civilization describe its own institutions, its cities, its kingship, its cosmic order as inheritances rather than inventions? The answer lies in what happened between the world before writing and the world after. It lies in the flood. Not just a flood. The flood. The one remembered in sediment layers, in myth cycles, in the break at the heart of the Sumerian king list. And that is where we turn next, to the moment when memory collapsed and everything that came before had to be rebuilt from what remained. But first, we must understand what the Sumerians believed existed before the flood. Before the gods had names. Before temples had purposes. Before humanity knew why it labored. Because the earliest texts described something older than divinity itself. In the British Museum, catalogue number K3445, sits a fragment of a tablet recovered from the library of Ashurbanipal in Nineveh. It contains one of the oldest surviving cosmological texts in the Sumerian language, a hymn that predates the great myths of Enki and Enlil by centuries. The hymn describes the world before differentiation, before skies separated from earth, before light emerged from darkness. And in this hymn there is no creator god. There is only Namu. But here is what makes this fragment so unsettling. Namu is never described doing anything. She does not speak. She does not command. She does not shape clay or breathe life or separate waters. The hymn simply states that she was the primordial condition, the undifferentiated whole, the cosmic sea from which all things would later emerge. Not a goddess estate. This distinction is not just about words. It is foundational. Across the entire collection of Sumerian religious texts, thousands of tablets spanning nearly 2,000 years, there is no temple dedicated to Namu, no priesthood, no cult, no ritual offerings, no prayers asking for her intervention. She appears in cosmological texts as the precondition for existence, and then she vanishes from the active religious life of Mesopotamia entirely. Why? Because the Sumerians did not worship origins. They worshipped functions. And Namu had no function. She was the absence of function, the state before roles were assigned, before hierarchy emerged, before the divine bureaucracy that would later govern heaven and earth came into being. Linguists studying early Sumerian vocabulary note that the word Namu shares a root with Alma, meaning mother. But the theological texts never treat her as a mother goddess, in the way later cultures would understand that term. She does not nurture. She does not protect. She does not give birth in any active sense. She is simply the medium, the dark water, the unshaped potential from which differentiation occurs. And that differentiation begins with two principles, not two beings in Enki heaven and earth. The earliest hymns describe them not as gods with personalities, but as the first separation, the primal division of the unified cosmos into distinct realms. And is the vault of the sky, the firmament, the boundary that holds back the waters above. Kai is the foundation, the solid ground, the platform upon which all future structure will rest. They have no myths of childhood, no stories of rivalry or romance or ambition, at least not in the earliest layers. They simply represent the first cosmic split above and below, masculine and feminine principle, the boundary and the bounded. In later texts, and becomes Anu, the distant sky father, the remote king of the gods, rarely intervening in earthly affairs. Kai becomes absorbed into other earth deities, her identity blurred, her role diminished. But in the oldest layers of Sumerian thought, before these transformations, and in Kai are not personalities. They are architecture, the structure of reality itself. This is radically different from what comes later. By the time the myths of the 3rd millennium BC are being inscribed, the gods have become fully human-like. Enki walks among reeds and speaks in riddles. Inanna descends to the underworld and negotiates with her sister. Enlil decrees fates and rages against humanity's noise. These are beings with desires, conflicts, histories. But in Enki have none of this. They are cosmic facts, not cosmic actors. And this raises a disturbing implication. The Sumerians preserved a memory of a time before gods had agency. Before divinity meant intervention. Before the sacred was personal. What kind of world remembers its gods as impersonal forces? A world that did not invent those gods, but inherited them. Consider the evidence. The earliest religious structures in southern Mesopotamia, shrines excavated at Eridu dating to the Ubaid period, roughly 5500 BC, show no iconography, no statues, no representations of divine figures. Just altars, offering tables, spaces for ritual organized around principles we can no longer fully decode. The gods as personalities come later. The temples are rebuilt generation after generation in exactly the same sacred footprint. But the who being worshipped evolves. Enki eventually claims Eridu as his city. But Enki does not appear in the archaeological record until thousands of years after the first shrine was built. So who or what was being honored before Enki arrived? The text suggests an answer, though it is one that resists easy interpretation. Early Sumerian hymns occasionally referred to Dindur, the word for god or divinity, as a quality, not a being. A divine essence that fills certain places, certain objects, certain natural phenomena. Not gods in the water, but the water itself as divine. Not gods of the earth, but the earth's sacred principle. This is not animism in the simple sense. It is something more abstract, the recognition that order itself, cosmic structure, natural law, the rhythms of season and flood, possessed a kind of divinity that predated any named deity. And when named deities finally do emerge in the record, they emerge as administrators of this order, not as creators. Enlil does not create the wind. He is the wind personified. Enki does not create fresh water. He governs it, channels it, makes it useful. The gods manage the systems they inherit. But someone or something had to build those systems first. The Sumerian scribes seem aware of this paradox. In the myth known as Enki in the world order, the god Enki travels across the land assigning roles and responsibilities to other deities. He gives the goddess Nanch dominion over fish and birds. He assigns the goddess Ninkasi the secret of brewing beer. He establishes the god Enton as overseer of agriculture. But the text never explains where these domains came from. Fish already swim. Grain already grows. Beer is already being brewed in the archaeological record long before this myth was written. Enki does not create these things. He simply formalizes who is in charge of them. The gods inherit a functioning world and then claim credit for its design. This pattern is consistent across Sumerian theology. The divine assembly does not create cosmic law. It declares it. Kingship does not begin with the gods. It descends from them. The calendar, the plow, the city all are treated as gifts from heaven. But gifts imply prior possession. The gods had these things before humanity received them. But where did the gods get them? The texts do not say. And perhaps that silence is the point. Perhaps the Sumerians understood something we have forgotten, that the world they inherited was older than their capacity to explain it. That the systems sustaining their civilization, irrigation, social hierarchy, astronomical observation, written language emerged from a depth of time no origin myth could adequately capture. So they did what any civilization does when faced with inheritance it cannot explain. They invented gods to represent what they could not remember. But those gods, in the earliest telling, are not creators. They are successors. Managers of an estate built by hands unknown. Rulers of a kingdom whose previous dynasty left no names. And nowhere is this more apparent than in the single most direct claim the Sumerians ever made about the origin of political authority. After kingship descended from heaven, kingship was an Eridu. Not established, not earned, not built, descended. As if the entire apparatus of governance, the concept of centralized rule, the hierarchy of administration, the authority of the throne existed somewhere else first, and then fell complete and functional into the waiting hands of the first human kings. Why would the Sumerians describe power this way? Why would they frame their own institutions as arrivals rather than inventions, as inheritances rather than achievements? The answer, waiting in the next layer of evidence, is more unsettling than divine intervention. It is historical catastrophe. Because between the world that built these systems and the world that remembered them, something broke. Something flooded. Something ended so completely that when civilization resumed, the survivors could no longer explain what they had inherited, only that it was already ancient when they found it. And into that gap between loss and memory, the gods descended, not to create, but to explain. The well-Blundell prism sits in the Ishmaelian Museum at Oxford, a clay object roughly 8 inches tall, inscribed on all 4 sides with one of the most complete versions of the Sumerian king list ever discovered. It was written sometime around 2000 BC, but it claims to document rulers stretching back to a time before the flood, when kings reigned for tens of thousands of years. The list is impossible, mythological, absurd by any rational standard. And yet, it opens with a single line that historians cannot dismiss. After kingship descended from heaven, kingship was an Eridu. Not began, not was established, not emerged from the will of the people or was seized by the strong descended. The verb means to come down, to fall from above. The same word used to describe rain falling from clouds or God stepping down from a temple platform. Kingship is treated not as a human invention, not as a social contract, not as an evolutionary development of tribal leadership, but as an object that arrived fully formed. This is not poetic language. This is a cosmological claim. And it raises an immediate, unavoidable question: if kingship descended, where was it before it descended? The text does not say. It simply asserts the transfer. Heaven possessed kingship. Then Eridu possessed it. The mechanism is left blank. The prior history is erased. Only the arrival is recorded. But here is what makes this formulation so strange. Eridu was already ancient when the king list was written. Archaeological surveys of the site reveal continuous habitation extending back to at least 5800 BC, more than 3,000 years before the earliest writing. The city did not appear suddenly. It grew slowly, generation by generation, shrine built upon shrine, canal extended after canal. So when exactly did kingship descend? The king list itself offers no date. It simply places Eridu first in the sequence of antediluvian cities, the cities that existed before the Great Flood. And it assigns to Eridu's early rulers reigns of staggering length. The first king, Alulim, supposedly ruled for 28,800 years. His successor Lalgar for 36,000 years. These are not historical figures. They cannot be no human lives 28 millennia. But they are also not random fabrications. The names follow consistent linguistic patterns. They appear in multiple versions of the king list with only minor variations. They are treated by the scribes as real, in some sense real enough to be written down generation after generation, copied from older tablets, preserved in temple archives. What are these names? One theory proposed by scholars analyzing the structure of early Mesopotamian chronology is that these impossibly long reigns represent not individual rulers, but dynasties' entire lineages compressed into single names. Alulum is not one king but a royal house. Alalgar is not a person but a period. But this still does not explain the central claim that kingship descended. Because even if we interpret the names as dynasties rather than individuals, the text still insists that the institution itself came from somewhere else. That governance, hierarchy, centralized authority, the entire apparatus of the state was not invented by the people of Eridu, but received by them. From whom? The text says heaven, the gods, the cosmic order. But gods do not write administrative records. Gods do not organize labor rosters or manage grain storage or settle land disputes. Human beings do. And the archaeological evidence from Eridu shows exactly this kind of administrative complexity emerging slowly over thousands of years, not descending in a single moment. Clay tokens used for accounting appear in the 6th millennium BC. Sealed containers indicating controlled distribution of resources. Communal storage facilities. Standardized pottery suggesting organized production. All the markers of hierarchical society developing gradually, not arriving intact. So why does the king list describe it as descent? The answer may lie in what happened between the establishment of these early systems and the moment writing began to record them: a rupture, a collapse, a flood. The king list itself divides history into 2 years before the flood and after the flood. And the language shifts dramatically at that boundary. Before the flood, kings reign for impossible lengths. After the flood, reign lengths drop to plausible human lifespans: 20 years, 30 years, 45 years. Before the flood, the list names 8 kings across 5 cities. After the flood, it names dozens of rulers across dozens of cities. And suddenly, the chronology begins to align with known archaeological sequences. The flood marks the transition from myth to history. But it also marks something else: the transition from memory to reconstruction. If a catastrophic flood erased institutional continuity, destroyed records, displaced populations, drowned cities, then the survivors would face a profound problem. They would inherit systems they no longer fully understood: irrigation networks already in place, sacred sites already designated, social hierarchies already assumed. And with no written records to explain where these systems came from, the only option would be to attribute them to divine origin. Kingship descended because no one could remember it being invented. This interpretation gained support from comparative evidence. In nearly every ancient civilization that experienced catastrophic disruption followed by recovery, we find origin myths that describe cultural institutions as gifts from the gods. The Egyptians claimed writing was given by Thoth. The Greeks said Prometheus brought fire. The Chinese credited the Yellow Emperor with agriculture. These are not naive superstitions. They are sophisticated explanations for inheritance. When you possess knowledge you did not develop, when you maintain systems you cannot trace to a human founder, when your cities stand on foundations older than your collective memory, you attribute their origins to something greater than human invention. You say they descended. But Eridu was not the only city named in the antediluvian sequence. The king list records that after Eridu, kingship moved to Bad-Tabir, then to Larak, then to Sippar, then to Shuruppak, 5 cities before the flood. 5 centers of organized power, each inheriting kingship from the one before, as if authority itself was a physical object being transferred from place to place. And then the flood comes. The cities are destroyed. The sequence breaks. When kingship resumes after the flood, it appears in Kish, a city hundreds of miles north of Eridu, in a completely different region. The continuity is severed. The transfer is reset. And yet, the institution itself survives. Kingship does not need to be reinvented. It simply is waiting to be claimed by whoever can consolidate power in the aftermath. This suggests that by the time the flood occurred, kingship as a concept, as a social technology, as a form of governance, was already so deeply embedded in Mesopotamian culture that even catastrophic disruption could not erase it. It had become structural, inevitable, part of the inherited order of the world. But inherited from whom? The gods, according to the theology. But theology is always written by the victors, by those who benefit from the legitimacy divine origin provides. Strip away the divine narrative, and what remains is a more unsettling historical pattern: cities functioning without recorded founders, administrative systems operating without documented invention, social hierarchies so ancient that even the Sumerians themselves could not trace them to a human source. Uruk offers the clearest example. By the late 4th millennium BC, Uruk was the largest city in the world, possibly 30,000 inhabitants, massive temple complexes, surrounding walls, administrative centers managing vast agricultural hinterlands. But the king list does not place Uruk in the antediluvian sequence. It appears only after the flood, as if the city itself did not exist before catastrophe reset the timeline. Yet excavations at Uruk reveal 18 distinct building levels stretching back to the Ubaid period, long before the flood horizons. The city was already there. The temples were already rising layer upon layer in unbroken succession. So why does the king list exclude Uruk from the pre-flood era? Perhaps because Uruk's kingship could not be traced to divine descent. Perhaps because its rulers emerged through mechanisms the scribes could not or would not document: conquest, wealth accumulation, control of trade routes, human ambition rather than heavenly mandate. And if that is true, then the king list is not a neutral record of who ruled when. It is a political document, conferring legitimacy on certain lineages by linking them to divine origin, while excluding others whose power derived from purely human sources. Kingship descended in Eridu because Eridu's priesthood claimed it did. But in Uruk, kingship was taken. And perhaps that distinction between power received and power seized is what the Sumerians were really recording when they wrote that kingship descended from heaven, not that the gods literally handed down a crown, but that some rulers could claim unbroken continuity with an older order while others could not. The former ruled by inheritance. The latter ruled by force. And inheritance requires something to inherit. So we return to the question the king list cannot answer: if kingship descended into Eridu, if it existed in heaven before it existed on earth, if the gods possessed it before humans received it, then who established the systems the gods themselves were managing? Who built the world the Anunnaki merely administered? The answer lies not in the king list, but beneath it, not in the names of kings, but in the layers of anonymous labor that made kingship possible. In the canals, the fields, the foundations of the cities themselves. Because before there were kings, there were builders. And those builders left no names, only evidence. In 1946, Iraqi archaeologist Fuad Safer descended into a test trench at Eridu, and kept digging through layers of Islamic pottery, through Babylonian remains, through Sumerian occupation levels. He reached virgin soil at nearly 20 feet below the current ground surface. And there, at the very bottom, he found the earliest shrine: a small rectangular building, met brick walls, an offering table, a niche for a cult object. No inscriptions. No dedication. No indication of which god, if any, was being honored. Just a space organized for ritual, built sometime around 5800 BC. And then Safer noticed something that would rewrite our understanding of Mesopotamian religion. Directly above this shrine, in perfect vertical alignment, sat another shrine. And above that, another. And another. 19 successive temple levels, each built directly on top of its predecessor, each maintaining the exact same orientation, the exact same sacred footprint, for more than 3,000 years. By the time the topmost temple was dedicated to Enki, god of freshwater, wisdom, and creation, 15 older versions had already been standing, rebuilt, and buried beneath it. Enki did not found Eridu. He inherited a sacred site already ancient beyond memory. This is the pattern that emerges everywhere archaeologists excavate in southern Mesopotamia cities, existing long before the gods who supposedly created them. At Uruk, the situation is even more dramatic. The Una precinct, later sacred to the goddess Inanna, shows architectural continuity stretching back to the late Ubaid period, roughly 4800 BC. But Inanna does not appear in the written record until the MID 3rd millennium, nearly 2,000 years later. For 2 millennia, something was being worshipped in that exact location. Offerings were made. Rituals performed. Buildings carefully maintained and periodically reconstructed with reverent precision. But no name was recorded. No mythology was written. No divine personality was assigned. What does it mean to worship at a shrine for 2,000 years without knowing, or at least without writing down the name of the deity? One possibility: the deity had no name because divinity itself was understood differently. Not as a person, but as a place. Not as an entity who intervened, but as a sacred quality inherent to the ground itself. This interpretation aligns with linguistic evidence. The Sumerian word for temple is which simply means house. But early inscriptions occasionally use the fuller phrase a dinger house of the divine essence, suggesting the building was not the residence of a god, but the container of something more abstract, a numinous presence tied to location rather than personality. The gods, as named individuals with specific domains and mythological histories, arrive after these houses are already standing. They move into temples they did not commission. They claim cities they did not found. They inherit worship that predates their own textual existence. And the stratigraphy confirms this everywhere we look. At Tel al-Ubaid, just outside Ur, excavations revealed a temple complex with foundations dating to the 5th millennium BC. The site would later be associated with the goddess Ninhursag, but the earliest levels contain no iconography linking the shrine to any specific deity, just altars, storage rooms for offerings, evidence of communal feasting. At Tel Brak in northern Mesopotamia, archaeologists uncovered the Saqaldai temple, named for the thousands of small alabaster idols with prominent eyes buried in its foundations. The temple dates to approximately 3300 BC, centuries before writing reaches the region. We have no idea which god was honored there, if any single god was honored at all. The eyes stare out from the past, silent and anonymous. What unites all these sites is continuity without documentation, human labor generation after generation maintaining sacred precincts whose original purpose has been lost to time. The myths say Enki built Eridu, but Enki does not appear in any text until the early dynastic period, around 2800 BC, 3000 years after the first shrine was raised. The myths say the sky god, founded Uruk, but Uruk's oldest occupation layers predate his emergence as a distinct personality by more than a millennium. The myths say the gods assigned each city its divine patron at the moment of creation, but the archaeology shows cities growing organically over thousands of years. Their sacred centers slowly accumulating prestige, their temple platforms rising incrementally higher as older structures were buried and rebuilt. There is no divine foundation moment. There is only slow, patient, anonymous human construction. And yet, when writing finally emerges, the scribes attribute everything to the gods. Why? Because by the time literacy develops, institutional memory has already failed. The people inscribing the first king lists and temple hymns are separated from the actual founders by such an expanse of time that the origins are no longer accessible. The cities are already old. The temples are already ancient. The social systems are already entrenched. And with no written records to consult, the scribes do what every culture does when confronted with inheritance. It cannot explain, they mythologize it. They attribute the city to divine will. They credit the temple to God's command. They describe kingship as descending from heaven because they cannot trace it to a human inventor. But the evidence beneath the myths tells a different story, a story of gradual accumulation, trial and error, communal labor organized not by divine decree, but by practical necessity. Consider the physical structure of early Mesopotamian temples. They are not built in a single campaign by divine fiat. They evolve. The earliest shrines are small, simple single rooms with offering platforms. Over generations, they expand. Courtyards are added. Storage chambers. Administrative wings. The buildings grow in complexity as the communities they serve grow in size and organizational capacity. This is not what divine foundation looks like. This is what human experiment looks like. At Eridu, between the first shrine and the great temple later dedicated to Enki, there are 18 intermediate stages. Some show experimentation with new architectural forms that were then abandoned. Some show repairs after floods. Some show periods where the temple was maintained but not expanded, suggesting economic stress or population decline. These are the rhythms of human history, not divine intervention. And then there are the anomalies, details that complicate the mythic narrative even further. At Uruk, during the late Uruk period around 3200 BC, there is a sudden explosion of monumental construction. The White Temple rises on a massive platform. The inner precinct is radically reorganized. Enormous labor forces are mobilized, moving millions of mud bricks, creating structures unlike anything seen before in Mesopotamia. Some scholars interpret this as evidence of the arrival of a new ideology, possibly the emergence of kingship itself as a formalized institution. The sudden scale suggests centralized authority capable of commanding vast resources. But here is the unsettling part: this monumental phase lasts only about 200 years. Then it stops. The massive building projects cease. Uruk continues to be occupied, but the frenzied construction ends. It is as if something drove the city to attempt something beyond its capacity, and then that drive collapsed or was abandoned or was forcibly ended. The myths do not record this rise in full. They describe Uruk as eternally great, eternally favored by the gods. But the ground tells a more volatile story. And across southern Mesopotamia, this pattern repeats: periods of rapid growth followed by contraction, phases of monumental ambition, followed by centuries of modest maintenance. The cities do not rise steadily towards some mythic golden age. They pulse. They surge and recede like tides. This is not what we expect from cities founded by immortal gods. This is what we expect from cities built by mortal hands responding to environmental pressures, economic opportunities, political conflicts, and forces we can no longer fully reconstruct. The gods enter the historical record to explain stability, to justify why certain families rule, why certain temples receive wealth, why certain cities dominate others. They provide ideological coherence to societies already functioning. But they do not explain origins. They obscure them. Because if you admit that your city was built by anonymous laborers over thousands of years, that your temples evolved from uncertain beginnings, that your king sees power rather than receiving it from heaven, then your authority becomes contingent, human, questionable. Far safer to claim divine foundation. Far more secure to assert that the gods planned everything from the beginning, that your position in the hierarchy reflects cosmic order rather than historical accident. But the ground does not lie. And beneath every temple dedicated to a named god, there are older layers. Beneath every palace inscribed with divine legitimacy, there are anonymous foundations. The cities were not given. They were built. The temples were not commanded into existence. They were raised brick by brick, generation by generation, by people whose names are lost. And the systems that made civilization possible, the canals, the storage networks, the labor hierarchies, the astronomical observations, the seasonal calendars, all emerged before writing, before named gods, before kings claimed descent from heaven. Which raises the final inescapable question: if the gods did not create these systems, and if writing began too late to record their invention, then who built them? Who organized the labor? Who dug the first canals? They convinced entire communities to work in coordination toward ends that would only benefit their great-grandchildren. The myths give us gods. The archaeology gives us gradual development. But neither explains the engine of transformation, the force that converted scattered villages into organized cities, that turned independent farmers into coordinated labor forces, that built systems so durable they outlasted the memory of their creators. But cities require more than belief. They require work, relentless, organized, multi-generational work. And that work left traces not in myth, not in royal inscriptions, but in the soil itself, in the layers of toil that made everything else possible. There's a tablet in the Yale Babylonian collection, catalog number YBC 7164, containing a Sumerian hymn that scholars call the creation of the pickaxe. It dates to approximately 1900 BC, but it preserves what may be one of the oldest creation narratives in Mesopotamian literature. The text does not describe the world being spoken into existence. It does not feature divine commands or supernatural manifestations. Instead, it describes Enlil, god of air and storms, creating the pickaxe and then using that pickaxe to break open the earth, so that humanity can sprout forth like plants from soil. But here is what makes the hymn so revealing: the language is not metaphorical. It is technical. The pickaxe is described with precise terminology: al, the Sumerian word for a specific type of mattock used in irrigation work. The breaking of the earth is bur, the verb for digging or excavating. The sprouting of humanity is yu, the same word used in agricultural contexts for the emergence of seedlings after planting. This is not cosmic magic. This is canal construction described as cosmology. And once you recognize the pattern, it appears everywhere in Sumerian creation literature. In the myth Enki and Ninmah, the gods create humanity to relieve themselves of agricultural labor. But the method of creation is not divine breath or sacred clay animated by supernatural power. It is modeling, the same word used for shaping bricks in a mold. The first humans are fashioned in a dub, a clay form identical to the process for manufacturing mud bricks, documented in early dynastic administrative texts. In the Genesis, the earliest known flood narrative, the creation of cities is described through a series of verbs: digging foundations, raising platforms, piling earth, establishing irrigation channels. The god Enki does not conjure cities into being. He builds them, using the same vocabulary found in actual construction records from 3rd millennium temple archives. The myths are not describing supernatural events. They are describing work: monumental, coordinated, multi-generational work elevated to the status of divine action. Why? Because the scale of labor required to build Mesopotamian civilization was so vast, so coordinated, so sustained across centuries, that it must have seemed superhuman to those who inherited the results. Consider what it actually took to transform the floodplains of southern Mesopotamia into habitable land. The region is flat, barely above sea level, scorched by summer heat, prone to catastrophic flooding in spring when snowmelt from the Zagros mountains surges down the Tigris and Euphrates. Without intervention, the land is mostly marsh, waterlogged, saline, unsuitable for agriculture. To make this landscape productive required radical transformation. First, you dig canals to divert river water inland, preventing floods from destroying settlements. Then you construct levees to contain the channels you have created. Then you excavate smaller distribution canals to carry water to fields during the dry season. Then you build drainage systems to prevent salt accumulation in the soil. Then you maintain all of this year after year, generation after generation, because silt clogs channels, floods breach levees, and neglect kills cities. Archaeological surveys of ancient canal systems in southern Iraq reveal networks spanning hundreds of miles, main channels 30 feet wide, secondary distributaries branching like capillaries, entire landscapes re-engineered to support human life. And this infrastructure predates writing by more than 1,000 years. The Ubaid period, roughly 6500 to 4000 BC, shows clear evidence of large-scale irrigation agriculture across southern Mesopotamia. Settlement patterns cluster along ancient watercourses. Soil analysis reveals deliberate water management. Population density suggests surplus production coordinated across multiple communities. Someone was organizing this labor, coordinating efforts across villages, planning systems that would take decades to complete, maintaining canals that benefited regions, not just individual families. But we have no names for these organizers, no inscriptions crediting their vision, no monuments commemorating their achievements, only the systems themselves, buried in sediment, visible now through satellite imagery and stratigraphic excavation. When writing finally emerges, these systems are already ancient. And the scribes attempting to explain their origins attribute them to the gods. Enki digs the canals. Enlil raises the levees. The Anunnaki organize the labor. Divine action stands in for human effort that can no longer be traced to individual actors. But the vocabulary betrays the truth. The gods are described doing exactly what the archaeological evidence shows humans actually did. In the Sumerian myth, The Debate Between Grain and Sheep, the text describes the Anunnaki gods before humanity's creation. And it says, they knew not the eating of bread, knew not the wearing of garments. They wandered the earth grazing like animals until grain and sheep were created to sustain them properly. This is a deeply strange claim: gods who do not know bread or clothing, gods who graze. Unless, and this is the unsettling implication, the text is remembering a time before organized agriculture, a time before textile production, a time when human communities lived differently, less structured, less hierarchical. And then something changed. Agriculture intensified. Labor became coordinated. Surpluses were stored and redistributed. Hierarchies emerged to manage the complexity. The myth calls this the creation of humanity. But the archaeological record shows it was something else: the reorganization of humanity, the transformation of scattered foragers and early farmers into disciplined laborers, working in systems larger than any individual could comprehend. The Ur period, roughly 4200 to 3100 BC, marks the explosion of this transformation. Cities grow to unprecedented size. Administrative technologies multiply. Cylinder seals appear for managing stored goods. Clay tokens evolve into numerical tablets. Ration lists document the distribution of bread and beer to workers. These are not the tools of divine magic. These are the tools of bureaucratic control. And the labor these bureaucracies organize was staggering. The White Temple platform at Uruk, constructed around 3200 BC, required an estimated 15 million mud bricks. Each brick weighing roughly 30 pounds, each molded by hand, dried in the sun, carried to the construction site, and set in place. If a single worker could produce 100 bricks per day, an optimistic estimate, the platform alone represents 150,000 days of labor, more than 400 years of continuous work by a single individual, or coordinated effort by hundreds of workers over multiple construction seasons. And this is just one building in one city during one period. Multiply this across southern Mesopotamia, across dozens of cities, hundreds of temples, thousands of miles of canals, and the labor investment becomes almost incomprehensible. No wonder the Sumerians credited it to gods. But here is the detail that disrupts even this explanation. The myths describe the gods themselves as resenting the labor. In the Atrahasis epic, one of the most complete creation narratives from ancient Mesopotamia, the gods rebel against their work. They are exhausted from digging canals, maintaining irrigation systems, performing the endless toil required to sustain the land. They go on strike. They burn their tools. They confront the high god Enlil and demand relief. The solution? Create humanity to do the work instead. This is not a story about divine generosity. This is a story about labor management, about one class of beings forcing another class to perform tasks they no longer wish to do themselves. And if we strip away the divine language, what remains is a memory of social reorganization, of a shift from communal labor to hierarchical labor, from work shared among equals to work extracted by elites. The gods are the administrators. The humans are the laborers. And creation is the moment when that hierarchy is formalized and made permanent. Supporting this interpretation, economic texts from the early dynastic period, approximately 2900 to 2300 BC, show temple institutions managing massive labor forces. Ration lists distribute barley and oil to workers categorized by task: brickmakers, canal diggers, shepherds, weavers. These workers are not slaves in the classical sense, but they are also not free. They are bound to the institution, dependent on redistributed rations, performing tasks assigned by temple administrators. This system appears fully formed in the earliest written records, as if it had been operating for generations before literacy captured it. And the myths describe its origin as divine creation. But the archaeology shows something more complex: gradual development of labor extraction mechanisms, slowly intensifying over centuries, until by the time writing begins, the system is so entrenched that no one can imagine an alternative. The gods did not create this system. Humans created it. But the humans who created it left no names, no monuments, no declarations of intent, only the systems themselves, and the myths that later explained them. Yet there is one more layer of evidence that complicates this picture further. Across southern Mesopotamia, at multiple sites, archaeologists have identified what they call collapse horizons: sudden disruptions in settlement patterns, abandonments of major sites, breaks in ceramic continuity, shifts in architectural styles. These collapses do not happen uniformly. Different regions experience disruption at different times. But one pattern emerges consistently between approximately 3900 and 3200 BC. During the transition from the Ubaid to the Uruk period, something destabilizes the existing order. Old centers are abandoned. New centers emerge. The careful gradual development visible in earlier periods gives way to rapid, sometimes chaotic transformation. And overlaying these collapse horizons, at multiple sites across the region, are thick deposits of water-laid sediment flood layers. Not the single universal deluge of myth, but repeated regional inundations, catastrophic enough to disrupt cities, destroy records, and sever institutional memory. When the floods recede, civilization resumes. But it resumes differently. The labor systems intensify. The hierarchies formalize. The gods who barely appear in pre-flood contexts suddenly dominate the post-flood record. Something broke between the world that built the first systems and the world that remembered them. And in that break, memory became myth, work became creation, and the laborers became gods. But then everything breaks. What event was powerful enough to erase the builders from memory and leave only their systems behind? The answer lies in the sediment itself. In 1929, British archaeologist Leonard Woolley was excavating the Royal Cemetery at Ur when he made a discovery that seemed to confirm the biblical flood. His workers dug through layers of graves, jewelry, and pottery, and then suddenly hit clean, water-laid silt. No artifacts. No occupation debris. Just 11 feet of sterile alluvial clay. Woolley kept digging. Below the silt layer, he found older pottery, different styles, evidence of earlier habitation, completely separated from the layers above. He telegraphed the Times of London, "We have found the flood." But he was wrong. And he was right. Wrong because this was not a universal deluge. The silt layer at Ur dates to approximately 3800 BC and extends across only part of the site. Other cities in Mesopotamia show no corresponding flood layer at that date. Right, because flood layers appear everywhere in southern Mesopotamia, just not at the same time. At Uruk, sediment disrupts occupation around 3500 BC. At Shuruppak, a massive flood horizon appears around 2900 BC. At Kish, water-laid deposits interrupt settlement around 3100 BC. At Lagash, inundation layers show up repeatedly across multiple periods. The flood was not one event. It was many events, catastrophic, regional, recurring, that collectively shaped how Mesopotamian civilization remembered its own origins. And each time the waters came, they erased more than buildings. They erased continuity. The Sumerian king list makes this explicit. After listing 8 kings who ruled for impossibly long periods across 5 antediluvian cities, the text states, "Then the flood swept over." And then after the flood had swept over and the kingship had descended from heaven, the kingship was in Kish. Not returned to the old cities. Not restored to the old dynasties. The kingship was in Kish, a different city, in a different region, with rulers bearing different names. The continuity is broken. The transfer is reset. Everything begins again. But begin again from what? The archaeological evidence suggests that post-flood populations inherited infrastructure they did not build. At Eridu, for example, major construction phases visible in the stratigraphic record predate the primary flood horizon at the site. After the flood, the temple is rebuilt, but on the same foundation, following the same orientation, maintaining the same sacred footprints. Whoever returned knew the place was holy. But did they know why? The same pattern appears at Uruk. The Una precinct shows flood disruption followed by reconstruction that preserves earlier alignments. The sacred geography survives even when institutional memory does not. This is what floods do. They destroy records while leaving structures. They kill populations while sparing foundations. They erase names while preserving systems. And when survivors return, they must explain what they find. Why is this place sacred? Because it has always been sacred. Who built this canal? The gods built it before our time. Where did kingship come from? It descended from heaven after the waters receded. Flood myths are not creation myths. They are survival myths. They explain discontinuity, not origins. And across Mesopotamian literature, the flood is never described as the beginning of the world, only as the end of an older one. In the Eridu Genesis, the oldest known flood narrative, civilization exists before the deluge. Cities are already functioning. Kingship is already established. The flood is divine punishment for humanity becoming too numerous, too noisy. The text explicitly states that after the flood, the survivor's Isudra is granted eternal life and settles in the land of Dilmun, the place where the sun rises somewhere beyond Mesopotamia entirely. He does not rebuild. He does not restore. He departs. The actual rebuilding is left to others, unnamed survivors who must reconstruct civilization from fragments. In the Atrahasis epic, the pattern is identical. The flood comes to reduce human population. The hero survives by building a boat. After the waters recede, he offers sacrifice, and the gods regret their destruction. But the text does not describe restoration. It simply resumes with humanity continuing, diminished but functional. The flood is rupture, not renewal. And the archaeological flood layers confirm this narrative structure. Sites that show flood sediment also show changes in material culture afterward. Pottery styles shift. Burial practices change. Administrative technologies evolve. The continuity visible in earlier periods fractures. At Shuruppak, the city associated in myth with the flood hero's Isudra, excavations revealed a flood layer nearly 5 feet thick, dating to approximately 2900 BC. Above this layer, the settlement continues, but differently: new architectural forms, new administrative seals, evidence of reoccupation by populations who may not have been the direct descendants of those who lived there before. The city survived, but its identity was reset. And if writing had existed before this flood, it did not survive it. Clay tablets dissolve in water. Archives stored in mudbrick buildings collapse when walls fail. Administrative continuity depends on records. And records depend on preservation. Lose the records, and you lose institutional memory. You lose the names of founders. You lose the history of how systems were built. You lose everything except the systems themselves, canals that still function, shrines that still stand, hierarchies that still demand obedience. And then, when writing finally does emerge in the late Ur period around 3200 BC, it appears after the major flood horizons. The first written documents are not narratives. They are administrative lists of goods, ration distributions, temple inventories. Bureaucracy precedes literature. Record-keeping precedes mythology. But eventually, as literacy expands, the scribes begin writing down the stories that explain their world. And those stories consistently describe a time before the flood when things were different, when kings lived for thousands of years, when the gods walked more openly among humans, when the world operated by rules no longer accessible. The flood marks the boundary between mythic time and historical time. Before impossibility, divinity, origins lost to memory. After plausible chronology, human-scale lifespans, documented events. The flood is not what created Mesopotamian civilization. It is what obscured the creation of Mesopotamian civilization. It is the event that made inheritance look like divine gift. And the survivors, returning to cities half buried in silt, looking at canals whose builders left no names, maintaining temples whose founders were forgotten, they did the only thing they could do. They attributed everything to the gods. Because when memory collapses, myth fills the void. When continuity breaks, divine descent explains the gap. When you inherit systems you did not build, you claim they descended from heaven. And the Anunnaki, the princely offspring, the divine administrators, step into the record precisely at this moment of explanatory need. Not as creators, but as the gods who reorganize what the flood had disrupted. Not as originators, but as successors. The gods who inherited a world already ancient when they arrived to manage it. But if the Anunnaki are inheritors, what exactly did they inherit? And who built the world they came to rule? The word Anunnaki first appears in written texts during the early dynastic period, approximately 2700 BC. Not in creation myths. Not in cosmological hymns. But in administrative documents, lists of offerings distributed to divine beings, ration allocations for temple personnel, inventories of goods managed by priestly bureaucracies. The Anunnaki entered the historical record as recipients of resources, not as cosmic architects. This is a startling inversion of how we typically imagine ancient gods. We expect deities to appear at the beginning of a tradition, creating the world, establishing order, then withdrawing into mythic background. But the Anunnaki do the opposite. They appear late after cities are already functioning, after writing has already begun documenting complex economies, after the systems they supposedly created are already operating. And when they do appear, they are described not as creators, but as managers. The text known as the Duties and Powers of the Gods catalogs the responsibilities assigned to various members of the Anunnaki. Enki oversees freshwater and wisdom. Enlil controls wind and agricultural fertility. Ninhursag manages birth and midwifery. Udu governs the sun and justice. Nana administers the moon and timekeeping. Each god has a domain. Each domain already exists. The gods do not bring these elements into being. They are placed in charge of them. This is bureaucratic delegation, not cosmic genesis. The structure mirrors precisely what we see in early dynastic administrative archives, temple institutions dividing responsibility across multiple officials, each managing specific aspects of the economy. One overseer for barley storage, another for livestock, another for textile production, another for irrigation maintenance. The divine realm replicates the institutional hierarchy of the human realm. Or perhaps it is the other way around, the human hierarchy legitimizes itself by claiming to mirror divine organization. Either way, the gods function as explanations for systems that were already operating before the gods were named. Consider how the Anunnaki are described in the myth Enki and the world order. Enki travels across Sumer, visiting each city, and formally assigns its function. Ur becomes the city of kingship. Mulaha becomes the land of black timber. The Tigris and Euphrates are given their courses. Grain is assigned its yield patterns. But Ur already is a city of kings when this text is written. Mulaha, probably the Indus Valley, already trades timber with Mesopotamia. The rivers already flow in their channels. Grain already grows in its seasonal rhythms. Enki does not create these realities. He declares them. He formalizes what already exists. This is the language of royal decree, of administrative ordinance, not of cosmological command. And the deeper we examine Anunnaki mythology, the more it resembles state apparatus disguised as divine narrative. In the myth Inanna and Enki, the goddess Inanna travels to Eridu and gets the god Enki drunk. While he is intoxicated, she convinces him to give her the me divine powers or cultural institutions. These me include kingship, priesthood, sexual practices, metalwork, writing, music, and numerous other elements of civilized life. Inanna then loads these me into her boat and flees back to Europe before Enki sobers up and realizes what he has done. This is not a creation story. These institutions already exist in Enki's possession. Inanna does not invent them. She redistributes them. She transfers institutional authority from one city to another. The myth describes political competition between temple centers, each claiming legitimacy over specific domains. Uruk, asserting its cultural superiority over Ritu, one city's priesthood, claiming it has absorbed the sacred knowledge once held by another. The gods are proxies for urban rivalry. And the Anunnaki as a collective function as the divine assembly that legitimizes whichever city currently holds political dominance. Texts from the Year 3 period, approximately 2100 BC, describe the Anunnaki gathering to pronounce judgments, assign fates, and decree the destinies of kings. But these divine assemblies meet in whatever city is currently politically powerful. When Ur dominates, the assembly convenes in Ur. When Babylon rises, the assembly convenes in Babylon. The gods follow power. They do not create it. Even the etymology of Anunnaki reveals this administrative character. The name derives from An, the sky god, and Anunnaki, meaning princely offspring or nobility. They are explicitly the children of heaven, a divine aristocracy, inheritors of cosmic authority rather than self-made creators. And like all aristocracies, they are defined by hierarchy. The great Anunnaki number 7, the most senior gods who make the critical decisions. Below them were the lesser Anunnaki, hundreds of minor deities assigned to specific tasks, guarding gates, managing storehouses, overseeing irrigation districts. This is not a pantheon of equals. This is a stratified administration. And it appears in the texts exactly when Mesopotamian society itself becomes rigidly stratified, when kings claim absolute authority, when temple institutions control vast labor forces, when social mobility freezes and hereditary class becomes entrenched. The gods do not create hierarchy. They reflect it. But here is the most revealing detail: the Anunnaki have no creation myth of their own. The texts never explain where the Anunnaki came from, how they were born, or who gave them their authority. They simply exist, already organized, already assigned their roles, already governing a cosmos that was somehow already there when they arrived. Even An, the father of the Anunnaki, is not described creating the world. He presides over it. He rules from his distant heaven. But the actual mechanics of cosmic formation are attributed to earlier, bigger forces: Namu, the primordial waters. The separation of An and Kai, heaven and earth. Processes that occur before named gods act. The Anunnaki inherit their positions just as surely as Sumerian kings inherit theirs. And this inheritance is precisely what the myths exist to legitimize. If you are a priest in Uruk around 2500 BC, managing temple lands, collecting taxes, distributing rations to workers, you need an explanation for your authority. You need a reason why farmers should give you their grain, why laborers should obey your commands, why the social order you benefit from should be considered natural and unchangeable. So you write texts describing how the gods organize the world, exactly as you have organized the temple economy. You describe Enki assigning roles to lesser deities, exactly as you assign tasks to temple workers. You describe the Anunnaki holding assembly and decreeing fates, exactly as the city council meets to settle disputes. The divine realm becomes a mirror of the institutional realm. And the institutional realm claims legitimacy by pointing to the divine mirror. The gods do not explain order. They justify it. But this raises the deeper question, the one the myths cannot answer. If the gods only explain systems that already exist, what explains those systems before the gods arrive to formalize them? If the Anunnaki are administrators of canals they did not dig, cities they did not found, hierarchies they did not invent, then who built what they inherited? The myths cannot say. Because to answer that question honestly would be to admit that human beings, not gods, created civilization. That authority is contingent, not eternal. That the systems which seem so natural, so cosmic, so divinely ordained are actually historical accidents, products of specific circumstances, inventions by people whose names have been lost. And once you admit that, the entire edifice of divine legitimacy collapses. So the myths stay silent about origins. They begin with inheritance. They describe gods stepping into roles that already exist, in a world already organized. And they leave the question unanswered: what came before the gods arrived to explain it? Human memory is a fragile archive. Without writing, knowledge survives only as long as someone remembers to pass it forward. 3 generations of disruption, war, famine, flood, and entire technical traditions vanish. The knowledge of how to build a specific type of kiln, how to navigate by certain stars, how to negotiate water rights between competing villages, all of it can disappear in less than a century. But the structure survives longer than the facts. Anthropologists studying oral cultures have documented this pattern repeatedly. When communities lose detailed historical knowledge, they preserve the essential relationships through narrative. The specific ancestor who founded the clan is forgotten, but the story of why clans matter is retained. The individual who first dug a canal is lost, but the principle that water must be shared according to ritual rules endures. Myth is what happens when facts collapse, but structure remains necessary. And in Mesopotamia, this process is visible in how divine narratives encode institutional knowledge that predates the texts themselves. The myth of Enki organizing the world is not arbitrary fantasy. It is a mnemonic map of how resources were actually distributed across Sumer. Each god's domain corresponds to a real economic sector. Each divine assignment reflects actual administrative divisions documented in early dynastic archives. The story preserves the system even after the origin of the system has been forgotten. Consider the myth of the sacred marriage, the ritual union between the king and the goddess Inanna, reenacted annually to ensure fertility and prosperity. This is not primitive superstition. It is encoded political theory. The king's legitimacy depends on divine approval. Divine approval is demonstrated through ritual performance. Ritual performance requires priestly participation. Therefore, the king cannot rule without the temple, and the temple cannot claim cosmic authority without the king. The myth encodes the interdependence of political and religious institutions of relationship that exists materially in the archaeological record long before it is articulated mythologically. Gods become the language through which institutional relationships are taught, remembered, and enforced. But there is something more profound happening. The gods do not merely preserve structures. They preserve ethics, patterns of behavior that maintain social cohesion, even when the reasons for those patterns are no longer understood. The story of the flood, for example, is not just about divine punishment. It encodes survival knowledge: build boats, store grain, respect water's destructive power. Do not settle in the lowest lying areas. Listen when the waters rise. These are practical lessons learned over generations of catastrophic floods. But once the specific floods are forgotten, once no living person remembers the disaster of 3800 BC or 2900 BC, the lesson must be encoded in a story dramatic enough to transmit across centuries. So the gods send the flood. The hero builds the boat. Humanity survives by remembering what the gods taught. The myth replaces eyewitness testimony with divine command, but the survival knowledge remains intact. This is why gods proliferate after writing begins, not before. Because writing arrives too late to document origins, but just in time to preserve the structures those origins produce. The first tablets record what already exists: temple economies, administrative hierarchies, seasonal rituals. But when scribes begin composing literature, when they start explaining why these systems exist, they have no historical records to consult. The systems are older than literacy itself. So they create gods to explain the systems. And the gods become repositories for everything the culture knows, but can no longer trace to a human source. Irrigation technique becomes Enki's gift. Astronomical observation becomes the wisdom of the celestial gods. Legal principles become the decrees of Udu, god of justice. Herbal medicine becomes knowledge granted by Ninasina, goddess of healing. The gods remember what humans forgot. Or more precisely, the gods become the mechanism by which forgotten human knowledge continues to function. And this is why divine mythology stabilizes after catastrophe. When floods disrupt cities, when populations are displaced, when institutional continuity fractures, myth becomes the thread that connects the survivors to what came before. You may not remember who built the temple, but you remember it is sacred to Inanna. You may not remember why this canal alignment matters, but you remember Enki ordained it. You may not remember the reasoning behind the harvest festival, but you remember the gods demanded. Myth preserves function when origin becomes inaccessible. And then the most unsettling realization emerges: if the gods are narrative containers for lost human knowledge, if they encode systems built by anonymous ancestors whose achievements were too distant to document, then what happens when we decode the myths? What if the gods remember what humans forgot? What if the Anunnaki, these divine administrators who appear late in the record to organize a world already functioning, are not inventing theology, but preserving it? What if they are the last echoes of something older? A world that existed, built systems, and then collapsed so completely that only divine metaphor could carry its memory forward. There's a phrase that appears repeatedly in Sumerian literature, so common it is easy to overlook: euphor liata, from days of old. It appears in temple dedications, royal inscriptions, mythological prologues. It signals that what follows is not new but inherited, not invented, but remembered, however imperfectly. The Sumerians were obsessed with antiquity, with what came before, with the lost knowledge of ancestors whose achievements they could see, but no longer explain. And this obsession reveals something profound: they did not believe they were the beginning. They believed they were the continuation of something already broken. The evidence converges from every direction. The archaeological record shows urban complexity developing over millennia before writing captures it. The textual record describes gods inheriting systems they did not create. The flood narratives mark ruptures between eras, not cosmic beginnings. The king list opens with "after kingship descended," placing even divine rule in a sequence of events, not at the origin point. Everything in Sumerian culture points backward towards something prior, something foundational, something lost. And the Anunnaki, these divine administrators who appear to organize the world, are not the creators of that lost foundation. They are its interpreters, its managers, its symbolic guardians. They are what survived when the builders did not. Imagine the situation clearly: a world develops over thousands of years. Communities coordinate labor. Engineers design irrigation systems sophisticated enough to sustain cities. Astronomers track celestial cycles accurate enough to create calendars. Architects develop construction techniques capable of raising monumental platforms. Administrators invent accounting methods to manage surpluses across generations. All of this happens before writing. Then catastrophe. Floods, perhaps multiple floods across centuries, each erasing portions of the institutional framework. Populations displaced. Records lost. Continuity severed. When stability returns, the survivors inherit infrastructure they did not build, canals whose designers left no names, temples whose founders are beyond memory, social hierarchies whose origins cannot be traced. Writing emerges in this post-catastrophe world, not to record the creation of civilization, but to manage what remains of it. The first tablets are not literature but inventories, ration lists, accounts of goods moving through systems already operating. And when literacy expands enough to include narrative, the scribes face an impossible task: explain a world older than explanation. So they create the Anunnaki, divine figures who represent the organizing principles the scribes can observe, but cannot trace to human origin. Gods who embody the institutions that sustain Sumerian life, but whose creation myths are conspicuously absent. The Anunnaki are not aliens who descended from the sky. They are metaphors for human achievements so ancient that even the ancients could not remember who achieved them. This is why the gods appear as bureaucrats rather than creators. Why they manage rather than invent. Why they inherit roles in a cosmos already structured. Because that is what the post-flood Sumerians were doing, managing systems inherited from a pre-flood world they could no longer fully comprehend. The myths are not fantasies. They are translations, attempts to render lost human history into a form that can be transmitted, remembered, and used to legitimize the present order. And once you see this pattern, the entire Sumerian worldview shifts into focus. They did not believe they were the first civilization. They believed they were rebuilding after collapse. They did not believe the gods created the world in their time. They believed the gods formalized what had survived from an earlier time. They were not primitives inventing mythology to explain natural phenomena. They were descendants of a complex society trying to preserve its institutional knowledge after the people who built those institutions had vanished. The Sumerians did not believe they were first. They believed they were late. And the oldest texts, these clay tablets pressed with wedge-ship marks, describing gods who organize rather than create, kings who inherit rather than innovate, cities already ancient when writing begins. These texts are not fantasies. They are funerals. Monuments to a lost world. Attempts to encode in permanent form what oral tradition could no longer reliably carry, that something came before. Something vast and coordinated and sophisticated. And then it ended. And all that remains is the inheritance, the canals, the temples, the hierarchies, the knowledge encoded in divine metaphor, because human memory failed. If our world collapsed tomorrow, if floods or fire or some other catastrophe erased our institutions, destroyed our records, displaced our populations, what would the survivors say about us 1,000 years later? Would they remember us as we were? Or would they invent gods to explain the systems we left behind? Would they attribute our achievements to divine intervention because they could no longer trace them to human hands? Would they call us the Anunnaki, the princely offspring who descended from heaven to organize the world? The Sumerian texts do not reveal a conspiracy of ancient aliens. They reveal something far more profound and far more human: the fragility of memory, the persistence of structures, and the way civilizations mythologize their own lost past. When catastrophe severs the thread of historical transmission, beneath the tablets, beneath the myths, beneath the names of gods, there was a human world. It built. It organized. It endured for millennia. And then it drowned. What remains is not the world itself, but its echo carried forward in stories too important to forget, even when the facts behind them have vanished. The gods remember what humans forgot. And we, reading these ancient texts, are remembering them.